I'm here with Angela Macey-Cushman, and she's an elder law attorney in Washington. Angela, first of all, thanks so much for joining me today and sharing your knowledge here. Second of all, can you just give me a quick introduction and just explain sort of what your firm does and what you do and how it fits into what we're doing here at Elder Guide?
Sure. So I'm Angela Macey-Cushman, and I'm a partner at Somers, Tamblin, Eisenhower, Black here in Seattle. Before law, I was a nurse and I worked in long-term care. So I've been working around these issues for a long time. And a big part of my practice is advising people who are planning for long-term care financing, which is, of course, a stressful situation for a lot of my clients. A lot of times exploring Medicaid eligibility is a pretty significant part of that consultation. They want to know, will I qualify? How could I qualify? And other times we're looking at other resources they have and trying to figure out how we can use those resources effectively without impoverishing them or their spouse, and looking for ways to help the whole family.
Right. And obviously, with what we're doing here at Elder Guide, with I think 70% of people in nursing homes now paying with Medicaid, Medicaid planning, and what you guys do is becoming increasingly more critical for people going into nursing homes. And, from state to state, one of the things we've been dealing with is how much these programs not only vary, but also within the state, how, Medicaid is sort of a generic term, and there end up being usually multiple programs, and oftentimes at least one program for nursing home care, but then separate programs for things like assisted living or home health care. Can you just sort of walk me through how that works in Washington, what types of programs you have there?
Sure. So a lot of our clients are coming in and they're doing two things. They're scrambling sometimes to look for long-term care facilities, and that's something that your website's very helpful on. The other thing they're trying to figure out is how to pay for it. And they've maybe heard that there's a program in our state that will help pay for the cost of long-term care, but most people don't know a whole lot about it. And maybe they have a misconception that Medicaid is just for people, families who are very low income. And for long-term care, there's a program in Washington, as in other states, that helps pay for the costs of long-term care, even for people who do have resources. There are resource and income limits, but for many people, especially middle-class people, there is a way forward with getting some help, because the cost of long-term care in our state runs, it's not uncommon for a skilled nursing facility to cost $10,000 a month or more. Right. So, even for someone who has resources and savings, that's a big burden to bear. Many people in Washington don't want to be in a facility, though. They need long-term care, they need help, but they don't want to be in a skilled nursing facility. And maybe that's not even the appropriate place for them to be. Washington has recognized this by setting up a waiver program called COPES, which pays for care not only in assisted living facilities and adult family homes, but also in the home. So you can have paid care providers in the home where Medicaid's paying for those providers. That helps people avoid needing to go into facilities if it's appropriate. We have several other waiver programs too. We have a waiver program for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, a waiver program for healthcare for workers with disabilities, and sometimes they need long-term care. We have some new programs for people who are getting close to Medicaid eligibility but aren't quite there yet. So if you are thinking about Medicaid, it's important to learn not just about the main long-term care Medicaid program, but to also see if any of these other waiver programs might help you pay for care.
How does it work as far as getting into these programs? I mean, do they typically have wait lists, or are some of them allowed as an entitlement?
Yeah, so some of them do have wait lists, but the main COPES waiver, although it technically could have a wait list, typically if you apply and you're eligible, you won't need to wait to start getting the benefit.
I guess it all comes down to just how many spots they have available, how many people are applying.
Yeah.
Fortunately for people applying, I guess, but unfortunate for others. I think a lot of people don't even know about these programs. So it's probably a tiny percentage of people who should be eligible who are actually looking into them.
Yeah, whenever someone has an intellectual or developmental disability, I always say, get started with an application, because that waiver program is more limited. But the COPES program for long-term care, at least at this point, you shouldn't feel like you can't apply, that you might not be able to get services because of spots in the program. Usually the barrier is actually being able to find home care providers who participate in the Medicaid program, or finding a facility that will accept Medicaid. A lot of times facilities, adult family homes and assisted living facilities that will accept Medicaid first have a private pay period that you have to get through. And so knowing about that in advance allows people to plan so that they retain enough assets to pay to get through that private pay period.
Yeah, it's sort of a second layer of planning of, impoverishing yourself enough to qualify, but not so much that you can't afford to meet these other requirements that are sort of artificially imposed by the facilities.
Right. You need to make sure you haven't given away all of your assets, and then you need to get through a 2-year private pay period at the adult family home that would be the best fit.
Right. And what about, you mentioned something in your guide about a non-Medicaid program. What about like Medicare related programs? What kind of, what do you have there in Washington?
Yeah, well, as everywhere else, a lot of people think that Medicare will pay for long-term care, and they're quite surprised when they call us and let us know the facility has said that they're at the end of their Medicare coverage, and They didn't realize there was going to be an end of their Medicare coverage for long-term care. So Medicare will pay for some long-term care, mostly for rehab care, but after that, then there are some other resources before Medicaid that sometimes can be helpful. One is if you're a veteran, or if your spouse was a veteran, you may qualify for a cash benefit program through the VA called Aid in Attendance, or another program. Also in Washington, we have 2 veterans homes, one in Port Orchard and one in Ording. And so some veterans would prefer to receive care in one of these facilities and be around other veterans. And they're both available to people who have a military background. Some people also have private long-term care insurance that they can go ahead and start using. A lot of times people don't press go on their long-term care insurance because they keep waiting and waiting, thinking they don't want to get started on it and then run out of benefits. I usually tell people, once you qualify for long-term care, it's often wise to go ahead and start those benefits. First of all, you'll stop paying the premiums because you'll be on the receiving end instead of the paying side. And you can start the plan then for how to get qualified for Medicaid if after you run out of long-term care insurance, if you're not going to be able to continue paying for care. Also in Washington, we have something that's brand new called the Long-Term Care Trust, which allows workers to pay into through their payroll, a program that will provide up to, right now the limit is $36,500 per person for long-term care. And the idea is that amount will be enough to help a lot of people get through kind of a short period of long-term care. But it's anticipated that it'll also provide some time for people to do some planning if they're going to need more long-term care than that. That isn't available yet. It won't be available for people to start using until 2025.
And would that be only people that are like in the workforce paying it, or could an 80-year-old person pay into that and get some coverage?
That's a good question. It's intended for people who are working age, and so they're paying in. Not to say that someone who's 80 wouldn't be working, but it's really designed as a program where you're paying in when you don't need the services, so that if someday you do need it, you're eligible to draw from the fund. Yeah,
that's really, I guess, actuarially speaking, the only way an insurance policy is ever going to work is if you have a lot of people paying in up front and then only getting paid out in the back end. So. Just sort of moving on to eligibility issues. So assuming I actually, need this level of care, I need nursing home care, I'm going to qualify for that. I know that, you need to meet 2 tests to get Medicaid. One is an income test and the second is an asset test. Now the income test, my understanding, is relatively easy to satisfy in Washington. You don't have like a hard income limit like other states do. But if, I have $4,000 or $5,000 a month of income, can you just kind of walk me through how that would work in Washington and what I'd be required to pay for, and then when my Medicaid benefits would kick in, and also how that differs between whether I'm looking at a nursing home or like assisted living?
Yeah, it's a little different. So the first thing we're looking at with most of our clients when they come in is what is their income and how close can that get them to paying for care? Because sometimes if they're going to be paying privately for a while, then we need to include that they're going to have their income hopefully available to help pay for the costs of care. And sometimes it's enough, especially if you're receiving limited in-home care. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to go through the process of applying for Medicaid if the benefit is going to be relatively small, because you're going to pay most of your income toward the cost of the care before Medicaid will start paying. So we always look at the income as a key factor. The something to keep in mind too is that the spouse's income is not counted. So it's very uneven. You may have a couple where the applicant's income is relatively low and the spouse's income is high, and that's actually kind of an easier situation for qualifying for Medicaid eligibility. What's hard is when the person with the higher income is the spouse who's also applying for Medicaid, because the rule is that you participate your income toward the cost of your care. And if your spouse is largely relying on that income, that can be really difficult. There's some exceptions where the spouse may be able to keep more of the income, but the rule is that you pay all of your income toward the cost of care in a skilled nursing facility or assisted living facility or adult family home, except $70, which you can imagine is not very much.
Can't do much of that.
Yeah, who can do anything with $70? I think it's an old-fashioned vision of long-term care where we imagine people sitting around in a nursing home and maybe their only expense in the month is getting their hair done, maybe getting their nails trimmed, the only expenses they have. But, in modern times, people who are receiving some long-term care services or even living in facilities have very active lives and a lot of expenses. So it's just sort of antiquated. If you are receiving COPEs in Washington for home care services, they let you keep a higher amount of your income because, an acknowledgement of the costs of maintaining the home. So there are some times when you're able to keep more of that income. It's really specific to the facts of any particular application.
And so you touched on this issue of sort of having to manage this situation for not only the person going into long-term care, but also the spouse. And that leads me into this, the asset test, which I want to touch on next. And, the asset test obviously seems straightforward in that, I think for nursing home care in Washington, you can have only $2,000 of assets, but many assets either aren't counted or there's some planning that you can do. And ultimately this becomes a fairly complex analysis in itself. But one of the most important things, obviously, is preserving as many of those assets as possible for the spouse that isn't going into the nursing home, the community spouse. How does the asset test work if I'm going into a nursing home and I'm married?
Yeah, an easy way to think about it is the person applying for Medicaid in Washington may only have $2,000, which usually, makes people feel faint because it's such a low amount, right? And it's hard for families to spend all the way down to $2,000 and still, have any sort of life for the spouse. However, in Washington, the spouse may also have a spousal resource limit of about it's 2020 right now. It's about $58,000 that the spouse can also have in countable resources. That can go up if the applicant's in a nursing home and applying for care in a nursing home. That limit could be even higher, but it really depends on the finances of the couple and the care that they're receiving. But in addition to the resource limit, a lot of applicants also have other resources that are not countable. So in Washington, you can have your residence where you live, or if you're single and you're getting care in a facility that you declare that you intend to return home to. You can also have a vehicle. You can have your personal property. So you don't have to go through the house and sell everything you have and try to liquidate things in order to pay for care before you can qualify. Those things are just not on the table to begin with. So in a lot of cases, the spouse has their own income that they continue to receive. They have their spousal resource amount, and they have their non-countable resources. Then anything they receive after that, after the eligibility, it's not counted. So if they then inherit money, meaning the spouse inherits money, or they are continuing to work and they have more income coming in, that doesn't count against the person who's qualified for Medicaid.
Okay. And so I wanted to actually walk through, some of the common assets that people typically have. You touched on real estate, and obviously you can exclude a significant amount of home equity here. The next asset that many people have is some type of a retirement account, whether it's an IRA or 401k or 403b. I know in some states, these also receive preferential treatment. I don't think that they do in Washington. But how do these accounts work? Is there any planning that you can do, anything you can do with these accounts, and sort of how does it work as far as the required minimum distribution coming out of them? What's your advice for people with significant retirement accounts?
Well, just generally speaking, and it's different for everyone, but generally speaking, in Washington, the retirement accounts are treated just like any other resource, and they're counted. So if you have $100,000 in an IRA, that is counted as $100,000 of countable resources. Now, the problem, as you know, is that if you take that $100,000 out of that IRA to transfer it to your spouse in order to qualify for Medicaid or to spend down on care, you're going to pay income taxes all in 1 year. Whereas the whole point of retirement savings in an account like an IRA or a 401k is to stretch out the income over time so that you're just paying income on the amount that you took out in that year. So when I have clients where the applicant has a large retirement account, such as an IRA or a 401k, then the question is, how can we get the money out of that account and into another form so they can eventually qualify for Medicaid? When someone comes in and they have a condition like early, they've just been diagnosed with early dementia, or they have ALS or multiple sclerosis or some other condition that's expected to progress over time, we start talking about how they could begin a plan to liquidate their retirement savings over time. So they can spread it over several years before they even need long-term care. And they often are working with a financial planner or a CPA or both, who's helping them time that out in the way that's most beneficial to them. But it is a mistake to think that your retirement accounts won't be counted if you need to apply for Medicaid.
Right.
For spouses, if they have a retirement account, it's treated a little differently. It's still treated as a countable resource toward their resource limit, but it's easier to roll that into, we haven't talked about this, but into an annuity that's accepted by Medicaid so that it can be kind of rolled into an annuity and then put back into their retirement account in many cases without a taxable moment occurring. This is pretty technical stuff. We always tell people to work with the financial person on this piece, but it's usually possible for the spouse's retirement account to be moved into a different savings vehicle so that they can still have their spouse qualify for Medicaid.
Well, that's great. And so, you hit on annuities. A related type of asset is life insurance. Another life insurance, you boil it down into two basic types. You have term life insurance, which I think typically isn't counted because it doesn't really have any asset value until you pass away. But then we also have like whole life insurance or universal life insurance, where it has some cash surrender value. How does life insurance work, and is there anything you can do there?
Yeah, in Washington, it is counted. So the face value, the cash out value, is counted as a countable resource. If you have a very small cash value, and a lot of times that's the case with burial funds, then it may be possible to either count it as an exempt burial fund or to use it as your countable resources. But for larger life insurance accounts or policies, sometimes it requires just that if you need to qualify for Medicaid, you're going to need to cash this out in order to spend that money down toward your care before you qualify for Medicaid. For other annuities that people may have purchased, most annuities are treated the same way. You'll need to look at what the cash out value is and either count that as part of your accountable resources or cash it out and spend it down. So there is a type of annuity that is okay with Medicaid. In fact, some people use it as a strategy to move funds that are over the resource limit into an immediate annuity or Medicaid annuity, where the the spouse basically purchases, they convert a resource into an income stream that pays back typically over 5 years, and in equal payments. And as that money comes back, the spouse can do with it as they wish. If it was originally in a retirement account, it may be able to go right back to the spouse's retirement account. The deal with this, though, from Medicaid's point of view, is that if the spouse passes away before the assets and the annuity have all been paid out, then Medicaid has a right of reimbursement for all of the money that they've spent for the Medicaid spouse. So it's definitely something that people would consider only if there's Medicaid on the table. It's not something that people use as a typical annuity for investment.
Moving on from assets now, another aspect of planning that I think is always or often sort of tangential to Medicaid planning is the use of special needs trusts. And we hear a lot about these being used in this context. How do special needs trusts work, and what are the scenarios where they might come into play with a person who is doing Medicaid or long-term care planning?
Yeah, the first one of the main uses for a special needs trust in our planning is for estate planning. So let me give you an example. If a couple comes in and we do all of this Medicaid planning so that the disabled spouse can get onto Medicaid, we need to follow through and make sure that if the spouse passes away first, that they don't inadvertently disqualify their spouse because of all those inherited resources coming back to the Medicaid spouse. That's a double grief. First of all, you've lost your spouse, and then also you've been disqualified for this benefit plan that you worked hard to get onto. So we use testamentary special needs trusts and estate planning quite often to prevent that. What that allows you to do is make those funds available for the disabled spouse, but not count against them for Medicaid. And that's a real benefit for a lot of our clients, where you think you're doing all the planning for this one spouse, but really the other spouse passes away first. A second big role is when we have clients who are under 65, because if they're under 65 and looking at needing long-term care, they may transfer their own assets into a special needs trust during their lifetime, and that's not penalized as a gift. It does have a Medicaid payback requirement, but it allows the person to stretch out using those funds for their own benefit, even after they go onto Medicaid. So if you're single and you're only allowed to have $2,000 in countable resources, it can be really nice if you also have money in a special needs trust for your benefit to pay for things that Medicaid won't pay for. One more thing where it's really important is when our clients come in and they're not quite eligible for Medicaid and they'd like to give money away, but they don't want to trigger a gifting penalty. So we always ask, do you have anyone that you want to give this money to who's disabled? Because there are times when you can transfer money to a disabled person without it triggering your own penalty period. But of course, you don't want to knock that person off of their benefits or make them ineligible. So a lot of times we set up special needs trusts so that they can make a gift that protects them because they can go onto Medicaid, but also protects the person they're giving the money to so that they can maintain their benefits.
Right. One of the things that you touched on there, I think is interesting, is there's, I think, this perception that the only reason to do Medicaid planning is to preserve your assets for your children or your heirs, or your spouse for that matter. But another side of that is your own care and your own expenses. And nursing homes or assisted living facilities, they don't cover every conceivable or provide every conceivable service. And sometimes the base package requires one level of care, but your quality of life could actually be significantly improved if you could afford to purchase some additional care or some particular service that isn't included.
Yeah, one great example is transportation. We have clients who have special needs trusts and they're living in a long-term care facility. And instead of relying on the public, it's called the Access program here in Seattle, they can call an Uber or they can use their own, a cabulance company using funds from a special needs trust. And for some of my clients who live out of town and have a lot of medical appointments in the city, this makes a huge difference for them. So something as simple as being able to pay for private transportation can make a big difference for folks.
Right. It makes sense. And with all of this planning, we have this first layer, which is essentially how do we qualify for Medicaid, or how do we qualify sooner? But and beyond that, we also have estate recovery. And if we go to a nursing home, we receive Medicaid. When we pass away, obviously the state is going to come after certain assets. I know some states are more aggressive than others. How does this work in Washington? And which assets are sort of at their disposal and which aren't? And is there anything you can do planning wise? That would fall into the realm of estate recovery planning, but essentially trying to retain the assets after you pass away as well for your family.
Yeah. So part of the agreement, and in Washington as in other places, is that when you go onto the Medicaid program, there are rules about how the state may assert a lien or claim on assets that you have after you pass away. It's kind of an agreement where they'll say, hey, yeah, you can still continue to own a home and be on our long-term care program without spending down the value of that home first. But if you still own that home when you pass away, then we have a right to recover the amount we've spent on behalf of you for your care. If you're married, it's very straightforward. You can transfer your interest in your home to your spouse, and that won't be subject to estate recovery. So the law has a lot of preferential treatment like that for people who are married, because transfers between spouses aren't subject to a gifting penalty. If you're not married, if you're single, then sometimes it's just a matter of making sure your heirs know about estate recovery and have an expectation that this will happen. It's still, even when estate recovery occurs, it's still only for the dollar value that Medicaid has paid for your care at the Medicaid reimbursement rate, and there's no interest that's accruing on that. So one way to look at it is that you and your family are able to continue owning the home. It's continuing to appreciate in value during that time while you're in long-term care. And the Medicaid lien on it is only going to be for the care that was paid for at the Medicaid reimbursement rate. And that's a lot lower than what you would have had to pay if you had to sell the home and pay for the care privately. So I always try to help people understand this isn't punitive, but you do need to understand it and set your expectations accordingly.
Right. One underlying theme of everything we're talking about here is there's so many misconceptions when you get into Medicaid, and people believing, like you said earlier, that it's only for the poor, or that they won't be able to get into the facility they want if they're on Medicaid. And some of this is just purely misinformation, but there also is some truth in it, as far as, like you touched on earlier, with some facilities requiring you private pay for a certain amount of time. But another mistake that I think people make is if they have, I don't know, $50,000 or $60,000, and they can afford to pay for a while, going into a facility without keeping Medicaid in mind, when in reality, unless you're relatively wealthy, you're going to end up on Medicaid eventually. Can you just walk me through the situation? Like, what happens if somebody goes into an assisted living facility, let's say, and they've got $50,000 or $60,000, they private pay for a while, they run out of resources, what happens next?
So if there's a private pay requirement at that facility, or if they don't participate in Medicaid, then there aren't that many options. You're looking at finding the money from someone else, maybe selling a home that you would otherwise treat as an exempt resource, or at least borrowing against it, trying to do whatever you can to pay for that care in the facility where you are. And if they eventually will accept Medicaid, you have a certain amount of time that you need to pay for that care privately. It's unfortunate when people move into facilities with a misconception about whether they're going to have enough money to pay for the care there for the long run. And it's very disappointing for people if they do run out of assets and aren't able to convert to Medicaid, either because they haven't made it through the private pay period or because the facility just doesn't participate in Medicaid. So planning is really important. You want to know not only what is the private pay period and what is the cost of care now, but is it likely to increase over the next, say it's a 2-year private pay requirement? what's the care likely going to cost a year and a half from now, so you can budget appropriately and not just try to cut it as close as you possibly can. You always want to leave a buffer when you're saving for long-term care. Another example is when people have to go to a much higher level of care. They've only saved for this level of care, but now they need care at a higher level that's going to be more expensive. So budgeting and planning is really important. If you do run out of money while you're living in a care facility, it is worthwhile to talk to the owner of the facility to see if you can negotiate, maybe privately paying the Medicaid reimbursement rate for a while, or paying what you can for a while. Sometimes they can be somewhat flexible. It's not a waste of time to talk with them about your particular situation. And sometimes, frankly, adult children, we end up paying to help out with our parents, to help get them through private pay periods so that they can be in a facility that they'll enjoy more in the long term than trying to immediately transfer to a facility that will take Medicaid right away. In some communities, there are wonderful facilities that will accept Medicaid right away. But in Washington, as anyone who lives here knows, the closer you are to Seattle, the more expensive the care is going to be, and the more likely it is that you're going to have a private pay period.
Right. Are there, what are some of the other major sort of misconceptions or mistakes that you see people making? And what is it that, what advice can you offer as an elder law attorney to prevent some of these?
Yeah. So sometimes people come in and they've already spent down to the last, they're down to their last few $1,000s. There's not a lot of planning we can do. Sometimes we can help people get onto the Medicaid program or help them figure out how to get onto the program. But if they'd come in a year or two before, we might have been able to help them take advantage of some of the resource allowances that they could have kept while applying for Medicaid. Another is misguided gifting. People hear, oh, hey, if I have money, then I won't be able to qualify for Medicaid. And I've just, suffered a health setback or been diagnosed with a condition that makes me think I might need long-term care. I'll gift away everything I can now, and then I'll be able to go into Medicaid. And maybe they even know that there's a 5-year look back in Washington. So they won't be able to qualify for Medicaid for the next 5 years, but they think, oh, I'll be able to get through that period of time. Well, it's really a problem if you've done this without proper planning, because if you're out of money and you can't get the money that you've gifted back, then it's not only a problem for you, it's also a problem for the people you've gifted the money to. So you may be trying to do something nice for your family, but you've actually made things difficult for them because our state's going to go looking to them for this money to be returned. So I'd say over-gifting and misguided gifting are unfortunately pretty common mistakes. And then I guess the third mistake is just kind of a feeling of hopelessness that sometimes people have, that they just won't be able to pay for long-term care. And so they stay at home without assistance for too long, to the point where they actually have injuries and a decline in their condition because they're not receiving the care they need. And so, I would say if you think you need care, if you're not able to manage your own activities of daily living, then it's really worth exploring whether or not you might qualify for a program, because these programs are set up to help people live longer, healthier lives. And if you need that kind of care, then it's, or if your parent does, or, someone in your life does need this level of care, it's usually much better to go ahead and find out and explore how to receive that care, whether it's in your home or in a facility, rather than just trying to avoid needing that help.
Yeah, right. There's sort of this I don't know, this American notion of wanting to stay in your home, living independently without getting any help, as long as humanly possible, is sort of going out with your boots on mentality. But, in many cases that's admirable, but, you also don't want to, you don't want to deprive yourself of necessary medical care or personal care and end up accelerating whatever conditions you have. And oftentimes, something as simple as home health care a few hours a day might make all the difference.
Yeah, and in Washington, we have a pretty new waiver program that's called MAC and TSOA, so MAC and TSOA. And these are programs set up for people who are really close to qualifying for Medicaid, or they already qualify, but they're still receiving care at home. And so there are some benefits available for people who fit those categories, so that they have some assistance with providing care at home. And it's great for everyone in the state because it helps stretch out the time that people are able to receive care off of Medicaid, just by giving them a little bit of support and giving their care providers a little bit of support so they can continue providing that care.
Well, it's great to see that, Washington seems to be recognizing this fact that if you can keep the person in the home longer or keep them in a lower level of care with some state assistance, in the long run, it's cheaper than having the person deteriorate and end up in a nursing home.
Right.
And hopefully other states or all states will eventually follow this trend. A lot of states have these programs where they have like 10-year waiting lists, and so it really doesn't do anybody any good, unfortunately. But the big takeaway I have here, beyond the state having a lot of helpful programs, is that this stuff is really complex. I mean, this has got to be one of the more complicated areas of law I've looked at. And, I think it's been great to have you. It's been great to have you here sharing this information with the users of our site. I hope that they find this helpful. I also hope that, if they need assistance with this, they'll give you a call. I mean, because most of this is not the kind of thing you can really do it yourself. It's not the kind of thing where you can follow the advice on someone's blog. There's a lot of considerations here between the planning for eligibility, the issues that come up, that arise when you have a spouse still in the home, estate recovery, et cetera. I think that you'd be a great resource for any of the users of our site. And I thank you so much for joining me today, Angela.
You're welcome. Thank you.